DRCOG used scenario planning to better understand the relationships between the intensity and location of new development, transportation system improvements, and mobility outcomes in the region. 2 land use scenarios and 5 transportation scenarios were created and tested against a baseline known as 2050 base. Additionally, staff combined land use scenarios with select transportation scenarios to see if there were any complementary effects on mobility outcomes in the region. For all of the scenarios, regardless of whether it was a land use scenario, a transportation scenario, or a combination of both, the same regional household and job growth projections were used out to 2050. Further, for the land use scenarios, modeling was anchored to local zoning to ensure that an increase in capacity was appropriate to its location. So an increase in Denver would look different from an increase in Castle Rock. Finally, the model's calibration wasn't changed and was kept consistent across all scenarios. DRCOG staff looked at 3 metrics to assess the outcome of each scenario: vehicle miles traveled, transit, walk, and bicycle trips, and vehicle hours of delay. By 2050, each of these metrics is expected to increase from the current 2020 levels. The first transportation scenario, the off-peak congestion scenario, widens I-25 and I-270 and rebuilds 4 interchanges across the region. Despite this investment, there is little change in vehicle miles traveled or transit trips, but there is a slight decrease in delay compared to the 2050 base. So a driver from Lone Tree to Broomfield would have a slightly shorter commute. In the managed lanes and operations scenario, a regional tollway network is built out. This results in people and vehicles experiencing 25% less delay on average compared to the 2050 base. Because of the increase in capacity, there's also a slight increase in vehicle miles traveled. The travel choices scenario builds out a regional bikeway and sidewalk network, slows speeds down on key corridors, and increases teleworking in the region. This results in 400,000 fewer drive-alone work trips every day, primarily driven by the increase in teleworkers. As expected, there is an increase in bicycle and pedestrian trips compared to the 2050 base, but this comes at a cost of a slight decrease in transit trips. The final transportation scenario, the transit scenario, builds out a regional bus rapid transit network, finishes fast tracks, and makes transit free. As expected, compared to the 2050 base, there are more transit trips taken, there are more households using transit, and there are more households who have good access to jobs through transit. However, there is only a 2% decrease in vehicle miles traveled, indicating that transit trips are a small percentage of all trips taken in the region. Now that each scenario's outcomes have been highlighted individually, they will be compared against each other and compared to the 2050 base using the previous 3 metrics: vehicle miles traveled, transit, walk, and bicycle trips, and vehicle hours of delay. Because the off-peak congestion scenario did not perform significantly different from the 2050 base, it has been combined into 1 bar. Across the remaining 3 transportation scenarios in green, the most significant impact on vehicle miles traveled was seen in the travel choices scenario, as there are now less folk driving and more walking and biking and teleworking. Not surprisingly, travel choices and transit scenarios increased the transit, walk, and bicycle trips compared to 2050. The most significant increase was seen in the travel choices scenario because of an increase in teleworking, biking, and walking. In the final metric, looking at vehicle hours of delay, all 3 of the remaining transportation scenarios decreased delay compared to the 2050 base, with the most significant decrease seen in the managed lanes and operations scenario and the travel choices scenario. The first land use scenario we'll look at is the infill scenario, which focuses infill and redevelopment in urban and inner suburban areas across the region, approximately 11% of the region's land area. Despite there being no additional transportation investments in this scenario, we see a decrease in vehicle miles traveled and a decrease in delay, and almost twice as many transit trips taken. When combined with the travel choices transportation scenario, these outcomes are impacted even further. There are now 14.5 million less vehicle miles traveled each day compared to the 2050 base. There are twice as many walking and biking trips, and there are now more transit trips taken than in the transit scenario by itself. The second land use scenario is the center scenario, which focuses development around urban centers, key employment centers, and rapid transit stations, approximately 3% of the region's land area. Again, while there are no additional transportation investments in this scenario, we see a decrease in delay and a decrease in vehicle miles traveled. There are also 3 times as many transit trips taken. When combined with the transportation scenario, these outcomes are impacted even further. Vehicle miles traveled decreased by 24%. There are 3 times as many walk and bicycle trips, and there are now 6 times as many transit trips compared to the 2050 base. This equates to about 2.4 million transit trips daily. Again, now that the outcomes have been seen individually, they will be compared against each other and a 2050 base using the previous 3 metrics. Each of the land use scenarios in orange and the combination scenarios in blue decrease vehicle miles traveled compared to the 2050 base, with the most significant decreases seen in the combination of scenarios, so the infill plus travel choices and the centers plus transit combo. Transit, walk, and bicycle trips increase across all the scenarios compared to the 2050 base, with the most significant increases seen in the centers land use scenario and the centers plus transit combination scenario. Finally, looking at vehicle hours of delay, all of the scenarios decrease delay compared to the 2050 base. However, the centers plus transit scenario actually decreases delay compared to 2020, hence the negative percentage. Your input on the scenario planning outcomes will help the development of the MetroVision Regional Transportation Plan and create investment priorities to guide project selection. For more information on scenario planning or the MetroVision Regional Transportation Plan, please visit drcog.org.